Welcome everyone to today's seminar on the geography of threats. That's led by Alfredo Romero-Muñoz. I might have said your second last name a little bit differently, but you can correct me afterwards. But it's a great pleasure to have you here today, Alfredo. And like I said, Alfredo is going to talk about threats in South America and specifically habitat destruction and hunting. And so Alfredo will probably talk about 40 minutes or thereabouts. And then after that, we're going to have Dr. Ranjini Murali reflect on what Alfredo has talked about and also draw some parallels and similarities with snow leopard landscapes. And we'll have a little bit of a discussion here for maybe about 10 minutes or so. And then we'll open up the floor for general questions. Over to you, Alfredo, and thanks again for joining us here today.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Gustav, for the introduction, and to the Snow Leopard Network again for inviting me. I think it's a nice opportunity to share the work, even though the landscapes are a bit different, but the species sometimes not so much. So I'll start sharing my screen. So I hope you can see my screen well. And so yeah, I'm going to talk about the geographies of threat, and more specifically, the impacts of habitat destruction and hunting on the large mammals of the Gran Chaco. As you know, the astonishing biodiversity of Earth is now in the middle of a global crisis, which is brought by the mass extinction situation in which we are now, in which the rates of extinctions are much higher than the background extinction rates. And these extinction rates are not random, and we are losing some entire branches of the tree of life more than others. And as we lose species, even though we don't destroy habitats, for instance, here, if we lose the large mammals that disperse seeds, the ecosystems will degrade anyway. So it's important to understand the threats that are causing this extinction crisis. And there are different levels of threats. First, we have the drivers of threats, like the consumption and trade of commodities, which in turn create pressures like agriculture and the expansion of infrastructure, which in turn creates the threats themselves, that are the activities that directly have an impact on biodiversity and ecosystems. And the main threats across the world currently are habitat destruction and overexploitation. And beyond occurring on their own and being important on their own, both threats might synergize. That means that they might act at the same time, at the same place, and exacerbate their impact. For instance, this is a satellite image of the Paraguayan Chaco a few decades ago. And we see that a road has been opened. And over time, this road that creates accessibility to hunters allows for the settlement of for agriculture, in this case for commodity production, which incentivize the construction of further roads. And over time, we have landscapes like this, where roads have expanded, therefore accessibility for hunters, but at the same time, this incentivates habitat destruction for agricultural expansion. And in some places, we see that only one threat might be acting, and in some other places, both threats, habitat destruction and hunting, are acting at the same time. So it's important to quantify these two threats, understand them in space. That means putting threats on the map. But this is a bit challenging because there is a lack of long-term data to understand how threats have changed over time. There is a lack of approaches to quantify the species-specific impacts of each threat, and to do this at high resolutions that can inform on-the-ground conservation practice and actions. And there have been attempts, of course, to understand this, but often they have focused either on single species at a single point in time, or when focusing on multiple species, they often have used expert-derived range maps, like the IUCN ones, which can only be used at very coarse resolutions. And often we cannot really derive a species-specific impact, so we have to generalize. So we have been developing in my lab the Geographies of Threat framework to understand the impact of multiple threats, where we try to understand the spatial impact of threats when they are alone and when they are together, and how they change over time, and do this at high spatial resolutions. The overall analytical approach is that, okay, we have threat A and threat B. So we can classify them at high and low levels. So we have areas that are suitable and safe, where both threats are low, where only one or the other threat is high, and where both threats are high. And to do this over time, at multiple points in time. Based on this, we can map the distribution of these categories of threat. And because we have multi-temporal information on this, we can predict the temporal change of the threats across space. And the unit to do this is a single species, but therefore we can do multiple species.
You got your
at the same time. And by studying our community, we can then analyze the geographies of threats for multiple facets of biodiversity, like the taxonomic diversity, just species richness, the phylogenetic diversity, and the functional diversity. And it is quite important to do this in tropical dry forest, because they have a high biodiversity and they have been settled for longer than rainforest, which receive most of the attention currently in terms of forests. 50% of the dry forests, tropical dry forests of the world have already been converted, and under 8% of them are protected. And the largest tropical dry forest in the world is the Gran Chaco, which is 1.1 million square kilometers, so roughly 3 times the size of Germany. But over the last couple of decades, it has been experiencing the highest deforestation rates in the world, but it still has relatively low research and conservation attention. The main reasons for this change have been the expansion of large-scale beef agribusiness to produce beef, and large-scale soy agribusiness, so mainly commodities. But at the same time, there is widespread hunting in the Chaco for different reasons, from subsistence to sports hunting. So the overall goal of this presentation, where I'm going to talk about the research that we have been doing and I have been leading over the last few years in the Conservation Biogeography Lab at Humboldt University, Berlin, is to understand the impact of habitat destruction and overexploitation on wildlife habitat and populations, and how these impacts change in space and over time. The research questions across these presentations are going to be where are the threats' footprints and how they change over time? What is the relative importance of each threat? And what are the key areas for specific conservation actions? And we do this at the level of species first, the jaguar, and then the community of mammals, and the different facets of the diversity of this community of mammals. And then we also include at the end an assessment of this, not at the level of habitat or only area-based approaches, but on the population dynamics of jaguar and puma. The first example or case study of this is focusing on the habitat of jaguar, which we published a few years ago with a group of collaborators that we continue to collaborate with across the countries of the Chaco, so Bolivia, Argentina, and Paraguay. So jaguars, and this might be the part that the Snow Leopard Network might be more interested in because it's about jaguars, are also large predators that are declining, like the snow leopard. They are quite vulnerable to threats. But how threats drive habitat change is poorly understood. And understanding this is important for effective conservation action. So the way that we reconstructed the geographies of threat for jaguar was by using habitat suitability models. First, we collected presence points across 3 decades, and also derived reconstructed the land cover change over 3 decades across the Chaco. So how forest changes to grassland and grassland to cropland and the multiple pathways there. And then with this information that contains multiple periods, we built a multi-temporal model approach. A habitat suitability model considering only the habitat predictors, and a hunting pressure model including the predictors of hunting, so accessibility, for instance. And we projected information to different times, to different years. And then for each of them, we classified the habitats according to the threats, as I explained earlier. And then again, projected this to multiple years to understand the distribution of these threat categories over time. So this is how the habitat for jaguar looked in 1985 regarding threats. So a lot of core areas with no threats, but a lot already of areas with hunting, and also areas with both threats. And over time, by 2013, the areas, especially with hunting and with both threats, increased quite a lot. This caused a decrease by a third of the core areas. Habitat destruction expanded by 20% and hunting by 27%. And 2/3 of the core areas that exist currently are unprotected. Protected areas shown here in black outline. So in conclusions for jaguars, both threats increase substantially, core areas decrease substantially as well. Hunting had a larger footprint, but areas with both threats together, which we are calling areas where potentially we have synergistic effects, expanded. And we identified key areas for conservation mainly in the northern Chaco, Bolivia, and Paraguay, and mainly across the boundaries between these two countries, but also with Argentina. So it's important to work across countries. But there are widespread areas with high extinction rates, high hunting risk. And this is important to discuss when we go into the population modeling, because we will go deeper into this situation. Then we expanded the work to assess the entire community of larger mammals, that is more than 1 kilo. And when we assess multiple species, reconstructing the impact of hunting becomes quite difficult. We could do it before for jaguar because jaguar has relatively a lot of data, but for most species this is more difficult. And this is a barrier for conservation planning, because if we only consider deforestation, we are missing part of the picture. So we focus on these 48 species of larger mammals. And again, we reconstructed the geographies of threat using habitat suitability models to reconstruct the resource aspects of the habitat. And then we applied a newly developed hunting pressure model that was developed by our colleague, our collaborator, Ana Benitez Lopez. So we use her model plus our habitat suitability models to classify, again, for each species, the core areas, no threats, and the areas with habitat destruction, hunting pressure, and both threats. And again, the change over time, over 3 decades. And to identify key areas for conservation, we weighted the core areas and the areas with threats by the species numbers and the species rarity. Therefore, areas that were more priority for conservation had more species or more species that are rare in the Chaco in terms of their distribution. We found that habitat destruction increased across almost 40% of the Chaco, and hunting pressure similarly, but a bit more. These areas are larger than the area that has been deforested in the Chaco, which amounts to roughly 20% of the Chaco. So the footprints of threats go beyond the deforested area. Per species, and this is how each species reacted over time, over 3 decades, most species suffer habitat destruction and an increased impact of hunting pressure. So most species are in this quadrant. So that means most species suffer an increase in the footprints of both threats within the range. But some species actually benefited. So negative habitat destruction would mean gained habitat, mainly because we predict that these species like open habitat. And threats expanded more in Paraguay, then Bolivia, and then in Argentina since 1985 to 2015. Then the areas with both threats that are shown here in this purple color increase over time. And that we hypothesize is indicative of an expansion of synergistic effects of hunting and habitat destruction. And this caused a decline of roughly 16% per species on average. And we identified here the priority areas in terms of core areas. That means the best safe habitat, but also the areas where each threat is having a disproportionate impact on the current biodiversity existing there. In yellow for hunting, blue for habitat destruction, and in purple for both threats. So in conclusion, the footprint of each threat was larger than the deforested area. Threats expanded, and this caused an important decline in core areas for most species. Across species, the relative impact of the footprints of each threat was relatively similar, but it varied among different species. But what we found that to be very striking was that the areas where both threats affect biodiversity increased significantly. In terms of key areas for conservation, we identified that priority areas, of core areas, are remaining again in northern Chaco, but that there are widespread hotspots of threats where threats are having an important impact on biodiversity. And our depiction of these key areas can guide complementary proactive, conserving these areas, and reactive, managing threat conservation actions. Then we move to the facets of biodiversity. And this is again a collaborative research where we expanded the previous research. And okay, we know how species are faring, but biodiversity is more complex than just species. And 3 facets that are commonly used to depict biodiversity more comprehensively are the taxonomic, the phylogenetic diversity showing the evolutionary history among species, and the functional diversity that can be depicted by the different roles that species in a community perform in the ecosystem. And these aspects are important to conserve as well and to understand how they are changing. But we have very little understanding on this currently, and especially about how different facets of biodiversity are affected by different threats. So we expanded the previous work. We used the maps of core areas from before, from the previous paper. We constructed a phylogenetic tree of the species and a trait matrix to identify the functional roles of species. With this, we could measure different indices for each facet. That's taxonomic diversity, phylogenetic, and functional diversity. And also the change over time, because we again did this over 3 decades. And this allowed us to map how each facet is faring, but also the change over time. In red, we're showing here areas that might have decline and areas that might have increase in blue for each facet. And then we use a new approach to attribute the decline of any of these facets by measuring the taxonomic, phylogenetic, or functional distinctiveness of each species. And therefore, this allowed us to link the threat, each threat, to the decline on each facet of biodiversity. And these are the maps of change that we produced. In red are the declines, and you see here are the main, is the main color here. So all biodiversity facets decline, but with varying patterns. And overall, they decline across roughly half of the assessed area of the Chaco. And functional diversity declined 50% faster than taxonomic and phylogenetic diversity. And again, the declines were higher in Paraguay, but were occurred across the 3 countries of Argentina and Bolivia as well. And then in terms of the attribution of which threat caused the decline in which facet, we see that the impact of threats was similar across facets. Hunting pressure, roughly 30% or 37%. Habitat destruction caused about 60% of decline, and the rest by both threats acting together. But when we look at the areas that suffer the highest loss, 20%, the top 25% loss, the impact of habitat destruction increased for functional diversity, and hunting increased a bit for phylogenetic diversity. And then to identify key areas for, or the priority areas, we see here how the key areas for each facet, the top 17% for each facet, overlaps with the others. So in purple is the 3 facets, and in the other colors is a single facet. And what we want to highlight here is that the overlap is not perfect. So in that moment, we had the Aichi targets. To conserve the top 17% of all facets, we would have to conserve 20% of the Chaco. In conclusions, in terms of footprints, both threats increase their footprints across all the 3 facets, and the facets decline across 40% of the Gran Chaco. The 3 facets, which indicate a generalized biotic impoverishment of the communities of mammals for the Gran Chaco. They are losing in every potential diversity measure. In terms of the relative importance, habitat destruction seemed to be more important for when looking at the different facets. Hunting became more important in areas for stronger losses of phylogenetic diversity. And in terms of key areas, we see that there is an extensive overlap of the different facets of biodiversity, but it's not perfect. And we need to conserve 23% of the Chaco to achieve the last decade's Aichi targets. Okay, and moving now to the last research. This is still not published. Now we move from simply an area-based approach of the impact of threats to measure the threats impacts at the level of population, on the population dynamics. And we focus on the large predators of the Gran Chaco, the jaguar and the puma. And again, we focus on habitat destruction and hunting pressure. I should have said this earlier, but when I talk about hunting pressure, I'm talking about hunting in general. That means overexploitation of wildlife. I'm not necessarily talk about the legality of it. The questions for this paper or this research were, what is the relative impact on the populations of habitat destruction and hunting? And where have populations changed with each threat? So the methods here vary a bit more. We built habitat models and hunting pressure models with the habitat models and the hunting pressure models developed by our collaborator. And we developed different threat scenarios. And we developed this and parameterized this based on the literature, just to see, you know, the population parameters of each species. But of course, species behavior changes in different regions, and the Chaco is one of the regions where we don't have that much information for several of the population parameters. So we use an expert elicitation process with the Delphi technique to calibrate a bit some of the parameters that we got from other regions for the Chaco, and to also refine what is the impact of threats on these parameters. And the threat scenarios are the no threat scenario, and this is a hypothetical historical past scenario where there were no threats. So let's imagine that this is where humans didn't exist in the Chaco and jaguar and puma live without human pressure in the past. And then the other scenarios are the current, depict the current levels of threats. So hunting pressure, habitat destruction, and both threats together at the current times. And then with this information, we use an individual-based model with Hexim, which is a software to do this, that was based on females only. And with this, we could understand the population trajectory and identify the population sources and sinks for the populations of jaguar and puma. This is how the population's trajectories went from the baseline historical scenario with no threats. What happened with under habitat destruction for the jaguar declined by 26%, under just hunting by 88%, and under both threats by 88% again. For puma, the declines were slightly lower for all the scenarios, decline by 22%, 77%, and 80%. So something interesting here that we start to see is that decline under hunting was similar than when we add hunting and habitat destruction. This is just to show how they fared inside the protected areas. And the only thing I want to highlight, protected areas are in red, and not protected areas are in green. What I want to highlight is that there used to be many more jaguars or pumas in unprotected areas, but currently there are more jaguars in protected areas in the Chaco, given the decline outside protected areas. And for pumas, there are still more pumas, we predict, outside protected areas, but they have declined a lot as well. In terms of where populations have declined from this historical baseline scenario to now, under each threat scenario, this is how they went. In red, we see the declines under habitat destruction, hunting pressure, and both threats together. Again, the footprint of the declines under hunting pressure are more widespread than with habitat destruction alone, and similar to when we use both threats together. And with this, we can identify the current population distribution that are depicted in green here for jaguar and for puma. So much more restricted than they used to be. But also, where are the population sources, where populations are growing in green, and where populations are declining in red, population sinks. So this can be very useful to identify where to act and where to do what under current threat levels. Yeah. So to summarize this research, the threats increased substantially in terms of the footprint on the populations. Hunting watch, in this case, was much more widespread when we take into account the population dynamics. Hunting was had a much more stronger decline than habitat destruction in terms of the impact on the populations. And we think that because the impact of both threats together is similar to hunting alone, we think that hunting is masking the impact of habitat destruction when they act together. But we think that both threats are interdependent. So hunting does not act in absence of habitat destruction. The process that I explained at the beginning of the presentation occurs. So there has to be some kind of habitat destruction for hunting to take place, even if it's just a linear clearing for a road. In terms of key areas for conservation, the main sources are again in the northern Chaco, but they are still starting to degrade. And to finalize, we saw that before that the threats are brought by pressures and drivers, and my research has focused only on threats, but it's important to start to connect the threats that happen on the ground to the external drivers of these threats, the underlying drivers of these threats. And we did a very small analysis of this, trying to connect the decline of jaguar across its range in Latin America to the export of soy and beef from the region. And we think that the commodity production has decreased the jaguar range across Latin America by 1.7 million square kilometers. So in conclusions, I kind of said already this. When looking at areas, the impact of both threats were larger than the impact of a single threat or deforestation alone. But this was different when we focus on the population dynamics, because we could understand a bit better what happened with the populations. Threats expanded fast. Hunting often was first to expand. And there were declines across all elements that we have assessed for the biodiversity of the Gran Chaco. In terms of the relative importance, both were very important, but their importance varied according to what we were looking at, different species, and whether looking at habitats or populations. We think that the areas with both threats are expanding, but hunting was clearly stronger for the populations of large predators. And there is, again, the interdependency among threats. They don't act on their own. In terms of key areas for conservation, we identify complementary areas for proactive conservation of areas without threats or low threats, and reactive conservation to managing threats where they are having the most impact currently. And opportunities remain, but they are closing fast. In general, this research contributes to understanding of the impacts of multiple threats on multiple elements of biodiversity. And we think that by implementing area-based actions to reduce these threats across the Gran Chaco and the borders of these countries, we'll still have the chance to save the rich biodiversity of the Gran Chaco for future generations. Thank you very much. Happy to get some questions or discussions or comments.
Thank you very much, Alfredo. That was very interesting and very informative, and a bit scary too. The threats that you are working with so large areas being lost. Habitat loss being so extensive. But I'm going to bounce over to Ranjini, and she's going to do a little bit of reflection and try and link to snow leopard landscapes. So.
Thanks, Gustav. Thanks, Alfredo. It was a really interesting discussion, and I really learned a lot. And it was interesting to also think about that, about your approach. I think when you look at like drivers and you look at pressures, then you look at the threats and the impact on biodiversity, and using that kind of an approach, I guess, to approach threats within snow leopard landscapes. Because I think one of the questions I had for you was, how did you identify for that area? Was it from literature? Was it from on-ground conversations? How did you identify those as the most important threats?
So just to understand whether to check if I understand your question, how did we end up focusing on this? Why did we choose these two threats?
Yeah.
Yes, there has, maybe I should stop sharing the screen for now, and I can come back if we need to show something from the slide. So we base this on the literature, yes, and there have been some analysis recently and some papers that ended up in very, the famous journals, identify that in different ways, because there is no even one way to classify threats, but they pointed towards this. And then focusing on the Chaco, is clear that habitat destruction is a major thing happening there, because we can see the deforestation. But also hunting is quite important for wildlife populations, that especially mammals. So that's why we ended up focusing on both of them. But doesn't mean that there are no other threats. But these, I think, for the Chaco at least, and for the mammals of the Chaco, they are the main ones. And again, they can happen because of different reasons. But at the end of the day, hunting and habitat destruction are clearly the more important ones.
Okay, thanks so much, Alfredo. Like I said, I like the approach by thinking of drivers and that lead to threats, because one of the, I think, things that we sometimes struggle with in snow leopard landscapes is these threats are really variable across different landscapes, right? So it's really hard sometimes to say this is the large overarching threat that happens across. And these threats with time are also, I guess, similar to the Gran Chaco, even in snow leopard landscapes. These threats keep changing, because earlier, to some extent, snow leopard landscapes were less accessible, because of the kind of terrain they had, fewer roads in these regions. But now, with these development pressures, the kind of threats are also fast changing in this landscape. So we've always, I think, Gustav, you can probably jump in here, but we've always tried to have some kind of difficulty identifying which are the main threats across the landscape, because, they seem to be locally, the kind of threats vary. So sometimes what we do is we have these assessments where we sit down with the community, or we talk to like different kinds of experts. So we have like this expert opinion kind of assessment to determine what are the kind of threats. And we've been trying to find a more, I guess, comparable approach to identify this and changing threats with time.
Yeah. I wonder which are then the threats that you discuss the most for the snow leopard. I guess hunting in some way should be there, right? I mean, I guess from my understanding, that's something that the snow leopard suffers from, either legal, illegal for different reasons. But hunting would be one. And which other threats are the ones that affect?
So I think the hunting, it varies. Like hunting happens with retaliatory killing. Our knowledge of, for example, illegal wildlife trade is still quite limited. And we know it happens. We don't know the extent to which it happens across the range. But there's other direct persecution that happens mostly in the form of retaliatory killing. There's other threats such as, I think when we think of habitat degradation, sometimes, overgrazing that can happen in these landscapes. There's things like mining, and those are more like large-scale habitat degradation, destruction actually that happens with mining. And of recent, there's also been a lot of road and other kind of large-scale, poorly planned, large-scale linear infrastructure constructions that's coming in. Some of the others, when we focus on snow leopards, also include prey reductions, right? So sometimes there's direct hunting of prey populations that lead to that's a threat to snow leopards. Were you able to quantify threats like that, like more indirect threats, like with puma and jaguar, they also depend on prey populations?
Yes, no, that's a good question, and it's something that we wanted to focus on for the last research on population dynamics. We really wanted to include prey, the impact of prey, depletion or prey change. But at the end, we couldn't do it because we found it very hard to depict the availability of prey across space and the change over time. So because the models that we use are very detailed in terms of space and time as well, often population models don't necessarily go at this level of detail. You just model the situation for the entire Chaco or for different patches, but we were doing it at the pixel level. So we need information for each pixel, which we model, of course, but became quite difficult to really do it for the prey. We have tried some things based on the research that we showed before of the community of mammals, but we did some, we attempted some of this, we tried some of these models, but we saw that wasn't informing much. And I think it's because we don't have so far enough information on the prey, but would be great to include. And yes, regarding what you were saying before about the main threats for the snow leopard, to me, and I'm not an expert and this has to be discussed more, but it sounds a bit like it's not too different, right? It seems that is hunting in some way. For some reason, we are also including retaliatory killing here, or the indicators of that rather. But degradation is another one, which might be more difficult to detect for mountain areas than for forest. But it's not too different, I think. It's roughly the same two things, plus prey, of course, which maybe is a bit harder.
Yeah, thanks, Alfredo. Actually, this question about prey brings me back to one of your findings where you said that, with habitat degradation, habitat destruction, the populations don't reduce as much. And with that, I was wondering, what about prey? Why do you think
that? On the population in the last research, or?
Yeah, and the last one where you were looking at the impact of habitat destruction and hunting on pumas and jaguar, and you said that with just habitat, this, and I find that really interesting because what this seems to suggest that in the absence of hunting, that both pumas and jaguars are able to find prey and proper habitat, even they're more generalist in that sense. So even in degraded habitats, they're able to find that. Could you help explain this a little bit? What do you think enables them to survive in spite of habitat degradation?
No, sure. And this is, this is one of the more interesting things that we found here, and goes a bit, not completely different than the findings that we got when looking at only habitat, but the results are more striking. So that the impact of habitat destruction is not that large. But I think it's reasonable. And again, this is not published, and we might have to keep discussing this with our collaborators. But what we see, even if we look at the habitat models, is that for jaguar and puma, they don't seem to lose that much habitat with deforestation as you expect. I know that for the community of mammals, yes, because other species are more affected by this, but just focusing on jaguar and puma, they don't seem to lose that much habitat, because again, the data that we use for the habitat models, for instance, are presence points. So we don't find a decline because we keep getting records, species records that they have been seen in areas that have been deforested, in pastures and croplands even. So they don't, if you take this as a good indicators of the presence, they don't seem to be suffering that much from deforestation alone. Also because they are generally species in some ways, and they are known to inhabit areas that are not forests as well, like savannas, and pumas are everywhere in the Americas, mountains to the Patagonia, So habitat destruction per se, I don't think affects them so much in that regard. But habitat destruction, what does is allows for accessibility of hunters and development and so on. So there is more likelihood of hunting when there is habitat destruction. And this is what explains most of their decline, which I think it was a bit surprising to see this in such detail for us, but I think is reasonable.
Yeah, thanks, Alfredo. This is extremely interesting. Yeah, it's extremely interesting. The other thing is, like, for prey, for example, if there's habitat destruction, one of the things that they also lose out is on prey. So then, assuming that they are losing out on prey here, they probably have, I don't know, livestock, or there's other replacements that they go into their diet, which can also increase, I guess, conservation conflicts.
Exactly. That's a really good point. Yes, that livestock can replace the prey.
Okay.
But again, these threats, what we want to stress a bit is that these threats really cannot be completely separated. We try to do that to understand, but in real life, I mean, we cannot just say, okay, let jaguars eat your livestock, but don't kill them, and everything is going to be fine, because that's unlikely to happen. But probably it's part of the story, yes.
Thanks so much, Alfredo. And like you're saying, I think there's several parallels we can draw with snow leopard landscapes. I'm going to quickly wrap this up because I can see there's quite a lot of questions in the chat. So I was just saying, like, for us also, if we're looking at it, like you said, we can look at destruction or degradation might be slightly harder to quantify, but if we're looking at, like, say, prey, if we're looking at livestock densities in the landscape, or you're looking at even large-scale destruction related to mining, or these other kind of linear infrastructures which we can map. So using different kinds of, I guess, variables or indicators, I think something similar like this can also be done in snow leopard landscapes, where we're looking at different, like, I'm assuming here, when you look at destruction, you were looking at deforestation alone. But for snow leopard landscapes, there are different variables we could put into a model to look at something similar. And hunting, of course, is much harder to quantify, I think. But yeah, I think this is something that we could also think of for snow leopard landscapes. So thanks so much, Alfredo.
Yeah, no worries. And happy to talk more. And just to add to what you were saying, I completely agree with what you said. And just to add that, our research is quite collaborative. That's why there are many people in the co-authors. So I don't do the entire thing, from the satellite analysis and the change of grasslands to croplands and so on. But we include that thanks to working collaboratively. And we can benefit a lot from this, like trying to build upon the research of others. And I'm saying this because I think there is also a lot of research going on across the Snow Leopard network, that these things can be built upon. So yeah, that was the main thing I wanted to say. Regarding the hunting, that's also something that we really were a bit lucky to. This was an issue, a challenge. We wouldn't have been able to progress with this like it went, how it went, if there wasn't a parallel research depicting hunting by this collaborator, Ana Benitez. And I'm just saying this because she built these models that could be applied for any species in forested areas in the tropics. Sorry, but maybe there is a way to adapt this a bit, or just apply them to areas that are not forest based on other information. So I'm just putting it out there. It might not be appropriate, but at least to explore this. Anyway.
Okay, well, thank you. We're going to open up now for questions from the audience, and I think I'm just going to ask people to ask their questions by turning on their microphones. So I'm going to go in order, more or less. Alina, if you want to repeat your question, just turn on your microphone and just ask Alfredo your questions. That would be great.
Sure, yeah. So thanks for that great presentation, and all of your research is super interesting. And I had a couple of questions. The first one is that one of your maps that you showed early on in your presentation seemed to show threat footprints inside the boundaries of protected areas. Mm-hmm. And do you have any ideas of maybe why that is? Are they like multi-use areas where hunting is permitted, or do they just have kind of lower protection statuses, or is it just not enforced well? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yes. So the reason we have those is because we simply really didn't take protected areas as a variable in as predictor, let's say. So we simply built the model and projected it into a maps, and then just only afterwards we added the protected area shapefiles just to see what's happening. That means that we didn't trust that protected areas do anything, which is just a conservative view, but they might, and it might vary among protected areas, just to explain how we did it. And that is because, well, the larger protected areas in the northern Chaco, in Bolivia and Paraguay, seem to be quite effective in conserving wildlife, but also they did, according to our models, there is the risk that the threats expanded inside them. And this is just to highlight that they have to be monitored better. The Bolivian case that I know better is that both protected areas and the largest protected areas, we have one that is the size of Belgium, are quite good so far, but that is because they are quite remote. But we just had a trip a few months ago to that protected area, and we saw hunters inside, coming from Paraguay that had to go back once they saw the rangers that we were with. So in short, it's just a conservative approach that protected areas do not necessarily protect very well, because you really need a lot of resources to protect against hunting, right? You really have to monitor that nobody's getting in and so on. And these areas, the Chaco is a quite close forest, so it's hard to really make sure that this is happening.
Yeah, so enforcement could definitely be in play there.
Yeah.
Okay, and then my second question, kind of linked, with the, the whole transboundary issues that with the Chaco, because of the 3 different countries that encompass it. What kind of, or are there any barriers present on those borders that you know of, like walls or fences or whatnot? Or like, are the challenges more of just kind of coordination between the countries of protection and enforcement?
So there are no barriers like as a frontier barrier. There are fences just because some, for instance, next to the Caia, there are some ranches in the Paraguayan side, and they put their fences, but they are not fences that are unpassable for wildlife, I think. But yes, there has to be some coordination among countries. There are already some protected areas that are along the boundary, but they are not necessarily completely connected. There is some separation sometimes. And there is this huge area in the Paraguayan Chaco that is a UNESCO reserve that is even larger than Belgium, but it's not completely protected. So you can deforest, I think, 50% of that area. So it's not a, it's not a like a national park in terms of how strict it is. So there seem to be some measures in place in this area between Bolivia and Paraguay mainly, but there has to be, I don't think it's going to be enough to protect much of the wildlife in the long term necessarily. So there has to be more coordination among the countries.
Okay, well, great. Thanks. And thank you, Alina. Thanks for nice answers. And we're going to move on then. Claudio, you had a question here. If you want to turn your microphone on and ask the question directly, I think that would be great.
Okay. Hi, Alfredo. Yeah, I was curious about the source of data used for hunting. I make some example like did you use interviews or some database with permits released? And also if you distinguish categories of hunting between poaching and legal hunting, if you included that in analysis, because I think dynamic could be different. Suppose that legal hunting can even reduce over time and the poaching could increase. I don't know. Did you set somehow this trouble?
Yes. No, thank you. No, it's quite interesting that so mainly we use the models that were produced on the basis of the article by Ana Benitez Lopez, and she started with a very nice paper in Science 2017. I'm just saying in case you want to look further into this. Yes. And then she produced the spatial analysis for this in a PLOS biology paper in 2019. Anyway, we adapted these models for the Chaco for the high resolution assessment that we were doing and for the characteristics of the species of the Chaco together with her. And she uses a mixed model based on a meta-analysis of the impacts of hunting on mammal, and she also analyzed birds, yeah, but we focus on mammals, on mammal species. So based on different spatial factors, especially accessibility, you can, she identified what is the curve of response, let's say, of the populations towards the source of the hunting. And again, it's based on that meta-analysis that we adapted for the Chaco. And we, again, assess our species based on that model. So if you want, you can look further into that. I'm happy to go into more details if you want to have a conversation later. And your second question was regarding differentiating between poaching and hunting. And no, we didn't do that. Partly because a lot of the hunting is illegal anyway. Mm-hmm. And the only hunting that might be legal is that for subsistence by the local communities. But we mix everything together. Also because enforcement really I don't think it's realistic to really go into differentiating this because enforcement is not that strong in that area. It's a very remote area in general. So I don't think we are going to really be able to differentiate this and be able to map.
Anyway, the legal hunting.
Legal and illegal hunting.
Anyway,
so that's
the legal
why we mix
hunting.
Everything together. Sorry?
Sorry, I understand that anyway, the legal hunting look like not much significant compared with the illegal one, because it's not easy to control. Huh?
Yes, but there might be, especially when talking about the broader community of mammals, legal hunting might have some impacts for some species. For jaguar and puma, for instance, I think, as far as I know, in all the countries is illegal.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. We're going to move on. I think, Rias, you have a question. If you want to turn on your microphone and ask your question, that would be great. Thanks.
Hello, hi, thank you. I had the same question about how you quantify the hunting, especially when it is illegal. So, as he was himself saying that they hardly see the hunters. So, how could you actually get to the hunting, quantifying the hunting? That's what I wanted to ask.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's still, as you say, we cannot really see the hunters, and it is still a quite challenging thing to model hunting. Much more difficult than habitat destruction. So again, we use this model based that Ana Benitez developed based on this meta-analysis, and the predictors of that are accessibility of hunters to more remote areas. And the predictors for these are settlements, distance to settlements, distance to roads, and we change it for different species. We use, again, an elicitation process with several experts across the Chaco of what constitutes an accessibility point for hunters to hunt each of the species. And just going into some details for the jaguar and puma, for instance, okay, roads, settlements, and so on, but also pastures where cattle is produced, for instance. And again, we could go, I think this is a research area that we'll keep developing because it's a challenging thing to do. And it's not necessarily perfect, but I think in general, looking across the Chaco, it gives I think a reasonable picture of what's happening.
Thank you, thank you. And I think we should also look into which areas are more protected and which are not, because hunters may go to the areas which are not that monitored or not well protected at all. Thank you.
Okay, I think I didn't hear well, but I think you said that we should look into the areas themselves and to assess what's happening with that. And yes, actually, this is something that we are starting to do, or we want to start doing, measuring hunting rates on the ground, and to have a more precise assessment of this, but we might not be able to assess the entire Chaco with this. It's a huge area, but understand more specifically what happens in a specific area. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. I think, Alina, you have another question here, if you want to ask that one.
Yeah, sorry, so many questions. This one kind of, changes topics real quick over to like disease threats. Are disease threats in the populations of jaguar or puma like a major threat, you think? And then also, you had mentioned that habitat destruction and building roads could be directly affecting the increase in hunting, which can also be linked to influx of domestic carnivores and their diseases. So like, are domestic dogs present in these landscapes? And what are they used for? Are they just feral, free roaming, or are they kept and monitored? Like that.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's an interesting question. And So disease, I don't think we know that much on diseases and how important they are. For sure, they exist. I know at least maybe there are more. I haven't focused on this, but I know there is one paper studying diseases that are transmitted by the hunters' dogs in the Caia National Park, which is this very large protected area in southern Bolivia. And they found in several other carnivore species that they carried these the pathogens at least. But that's the only example I know, and it wasn't necessarily that these diseases are causing mortality, or at least I haven't heard of these cases. But I think it's something to continue to explore for sure, because we don't know. And regarding the presence of dogs, we have found some dogs in some places, not in the very remote areas, but in some places, at least in my research in the Caia in Bolivia, we have found dogs sometimes. And I think this is something that should be explored further. I know that there are some people working in the Chaco that want to explore this further and potentially to link it with the potential for disease.
Okay, I don't see any more questions here in the chat. One thing I was thinking about, you work at an impressively large scale, and like Ranjini was saying, with the snow in the snow leopard landscapes, we tend to work on smaller scales and quite a few different threats. And in your study, it's almost depressing to see how much habitat you're losing. We have more habitat destruction, not total loss, but it seems like you have total loss. And I was going to ask, when you look forward, hunting had a bigger impact for now, but if you look forward, there's only so much habitats they can lose. What do you think will happen in the Chaco, looking forward? It seems like in the 30 years that you've been looking at, you lost a lot of habitat, and if you look another 30 years forward, illegal hunting, very challenging to regulate, but perhaps somehow you can limit it, but the habitat loss, where is it going to go? It would be interesting to hear a little bit of you, if you look into the future, what?
Yes, no, for sure. Again, one thing that we wanted to stress with this is that, and it's a bit of caution for me rather, that we don't want to give the impression that if you just stop or that habitat destruction is not very important for jaguar and puma. You can just destroy it, because what is really important is hunting. We don't want to say that, because hunting depends on habitat destruction. If there is no habitat destruction, there won't be hunting, because that's how accessibility and settlement and so on starts. That's one thing. And then, yes, regarding looking forward, I think it's a quite challenging situation in the Chaco. To be frank, there is a lot of work being done by different people trying to find alternatives, and I think those are good, like trying to in some ways make production more friendly, which can be good in areas that are already being produced. To work with ranchers so that they have to ranch, they will deforest and they will put cows, but ways in which they don't persecute, if that's the word, they don't kill the predator or the prey, so that they can coexist there. And I think that could have some important impacts or rather not have such negative impacts like currently ranching has overall on average. Of course, there are exceptions to that. But I think, the Chaco is a bit forgotten in terms of, like many other regions, but in terms of forested regions, the Chaco and other dry forests are a bit forgotten, and there are so many initiatives to conserve rainforests, which I think, they are good and they should continue. But there is really no international pressure to conserve the Chaco, for instance. So really these are areas, the Chaco, the Chiquitano as well, another dry forest. These are areas where I think the governments think nobody cares about these areas, so why not? You know, it's our chance, and let's do it fast before people start to care. So there has to be some international pressure as well to conserve these areas. Often even by conserving the Amazon and protecting the Amazon more strongly, what has happened before is that there has been a leakage. So the producers have said, okay, we cannot deforest here. Let's go and deforest the Cerrado and the Chaco. And this has happened a few years back. So I think this international pressure has to increase. And again, we went a bit from the threats back to the drivers. And this has to be better known internationally. For instance, in Europe, who is building this new law regarding the impacts of the commodities that are very important, should be accounted for that certain commodities really cause a lot of destruction, and we really don't gain much from producing them, especially beef. I mean, beef is produced at beef is inefficient and is produced in inefficient ways, and nobody really needs to eat that much beef. And again, this is not only international, our own countries consume a lot of beef, but it's also exported, and it's been exported more now. And soy is used for feeding livestock that then is used to feeding humans. So humans are not using these proteins from soy directly. We're just losing a lot of the nutrients by feeding first the animals. So this has to change as well, and this has implications because 80% of the soy that is produced in Latin America is exported to other places. So it's really the consumption for soy, at least outside Latin America, that is causing this the deforestation, which brings the hunting. So regarding this, I think I know it's very complicated. I'm just talking here. I'm not solving anything, but we have to connect the impacts to the consumers and to mainly regulations to reduce the impacts of the commodities that are being produced in the Chaco.
Well, thanks. Yeah, it's very interesting, you know, how complex and large and global some of these challenges are. You know, it's not enough. I mean, you're working in a really big area, but you know, that's affected by stuff that is happening on a different continent, and it can be a little bit similar to in the snow leopard landscapes. One big threat is the overgrazing, and it's because, you know, there's a demand for cashmere in the west, and cashmere comes from the underwool of goats, and there's a lot of goats in this area. So of course, if you can make more money, of course you're going to have more and more goats. So it's something that's driven from another part of the world. You know, the demand from another part of the world is having an impact in a different place of the world, very similar to what you are. So I think it will. You were mentioning drivers, and I think it sounded like you're going to work more on that. And I think we will all be very interested in follow your work on that. And we've already been almost 80 minutes here, so I think we're going to cut it there. But thank you so much, Alfredo, for a very nice talk, and thank you everyone for participating. And super interesting to see the parallels. And yeah, did you want to say just something very end here, Ranjini, or did you have something to add there?
I just want to say thank you so much, Alfredo, for giving us your time. It was a really interesting talk. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you again, Alfredo. Great talk, very interesting, and thank you everyone for participating.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Our pleasure. Thanks.